Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Katie Seacrest. I work for the State Department of Agriculture, and welcome to the second workshop of the Soil Fertility and Nutrient Management Workshop Series. Some reminders: do not panic if you lose connection with Zoom. Rejoin the meeting as you can, and if there's any problems, you can just let us know in the chat box. Also, we're going to mute your video camera and also your audio during presentations, so that way there's not additional feedback. And also use the chat box if you have questions, or you can hit the raise your hand button, which is available. And again, if you have issues related to Zoom, you can also raise your hand as well. We will have time for question and answer at the end of each presentation. Also, if you are wanting CEU or CCH credits, please type your name and that you want CEU and or CCH credits in the chat box. That way we have a record of who is wanting those credits. And so yeah, we'll begin here. And our first speaker is Jamie Boltmeyer with A&L Great Lake Labs out of Fort Wayne. And then we have Olivia Yakel, who will then talk about manure regulations from IDIM. And then Brad Colhagen with Adams County Purdue Extension will be talking about PARP. And Lindsay Blom of ISDA will host the question and answer part. So Jamie, if you're ready, you can begin.
Thanks, Katie. Can you hear me just fine? I wanted to check before we got too deep. So let me pull my screen up and we'll dig into it. For those of you that joined us last week, we spent just a little bit of, the hour time frame looking at some basics of soil in general. How organic matter behaves, how water movement gets, water moves through soil. So now what we're gonna do this week is we're gonna dig into some more details. Now we're gonna get this week into soil sampling. How do we collect a good sample? How do we collect a bad sample? We'll cover some of the don'ts. And then we'll start getting into some of the strategies in soil sampling. And we'll take a look specifically at precision ag a little bit and see how that plays in. And I've got some real world examples for my own farming operation. So with that being said, I'll give you a little bit of a background about myself. You always want to know if the person that's sharing with you during the event knows anything, and I'll start off that I don't, so that way I only have the opportunity to move up. But a little bit of background. So I am a Boilermaker by training. I did both my undergraduate and master's degree in Purdue. My undergraduate was in crop and soil science, basic agronomy. My master's was in soil fertility and weed science. I actually looked at how soil pH impacted herbicide control and weed growth. So I've had a soil fertility background for quite some time. But my real interest is in production agriculture. I was raised on a farm and I actually actively farm now. I'm really interested in how I can take what I've learned, what we know about soil fertility, and actually apply it to production agriculture. My first job was actually with a cooperative. I was an agronomist and salesman. I did some custom application, drove semi, loaded rail, and did some grain dumping. It was a jack of all trades, but a great opportunity to learn the ag retail business. I was with a group called Champaign Landmark. It's actually now part of the Heritage Cooperative System in West Central Ohio. Was doing that as my wife was finishing her master's degree in agronomy at The Ohio State University. Then I had an opportunity to take my agronomy a different route, went into John Deere, focus on precision ag and how it relates to fertility predominantly. And had the great opportunity then in 2013 to slow down a little bit, quit traveling quite as much, and take a technical sales role with A&L Great Lakes Laboratories in Fort Wayne. And that's a picture down in the lower left-hand corner of my two sons and my wife, and our farm logo there at the farm. We actively raise corn, beans, wheat, some hay, chicken, sheep, quail, and pheasant from time to time. So diversified small operation trying to get started, but you'll find that a lot of times I try to tie what I'm sharing back to production agriculture. And if you have questions in that line, and when we get towards the end, we'll definitely address them. So let's jump in. So why do we soil test? And that's a great question because everybody does it for a bit of a different reason. Um, well, first thing is you take a soil test. You want to see what is my soil level to evaluate what happened in the past. Have I been putting on too much? Has the previous landlord, caretaker, the previous farmer applied too much? Did they apply too little? And we need to adjust and make arrangements. The second part is to determine I am here. This is how much fertility in my soil. How much do I need to apply in the future to meet my goals? And sometimes people don't pay attention to both of those. Sometimes they simply pull a sample, look forward, put that soil test report in a drawer, and never look at it again. And that's one of the probably the greatest waste of value in soil testing is not looking at that soil test time and time again to see how it's changing over time. And we'll talk about that some. Help determine economic return. This is a concept that I think a lot of people misunderstand, and we'll dive into it a little bit later in the presentation. Is if I apply fertilizer, will I get economic return on that material? Will it have a yield impact? And that's sometimes easy to answer and sometimes not. But we'll get into the concepts and how that relates to fertilizer applications. To identify problems. What's limiting my yield? We talked the first time last week about Liebig's law of the minimum. Is one of my staves in my barrel that's holding my yield back related to fertility? And sometimes you'll find it's not. But until you take a soil test, you don't know. And also sometimes to investigate environmental impact. We'll talk about some situations and specifically around phosphorus towards the end of the presentation where, okay, if I apply fertilizer, what's the impact to the environment? How much will I lose? And I'm going to share with you right up front, as a producer, I'm also an environmentalist by heart. I focus on farm management by return on investment. If I put fertilizer on a field, I want to get the benefit of that fertilizer either in improved crops this year or in the future. I don't want to simply put it on and lose it, because if I put it on and it leaves my field, I'm not going to have very good economic return on them. So my goals is how can I get the most with the least amount? And usually you'll find that goes hand in hand with strong environmental protection as well. So we'll get into that a little bit deeper, but I want to start to give you an idea and an overview of where we're going. But I also need to I need you to understand what soil testing is not. It's not static. It doesn't stay steady. It changes constantly. Sometimes it can change literally within the week. The thing is, though, is the change is usually minimal. And some people get really hooked, or get really concerned about, oh, it's changed by 10%. In the grand scheme of things, that's not much. Then there's other folks that think it never changes, and that's not true. So I want to be very clear. It is not static. It's not uniform across the field. I have had situations where you move 5 feet and it might be 3 times higher. And we'll talk about those some situations at the end in some real world application. It is not a total amount of nutrient. In the soil testing, we are actually using what we call extractable nutrients. What does a weak acid, you'll call them extractants at the laboratory, but what does that weak acid pull out of the sample? It's usually only about 3 to 5% of the total nutrient in the soil. That is the percent or mimic of what is plant available. That is what the soil will release to plant uptake. That's what's potential for loss, potential for build, but it's not the total. For example, in potassium, we're only working with about 3.5 to 4% of the total potassium in the soil. The rest of it's usually locked up in minerals that are non-plant available and not accessible. And if you get a soil test that's in pounds per acre, that is not the amount of that fertilizer in the soil. A soil test is a concentration. Pounds per acre just happens to be a unit. Sometimes you'll have folks come in and say, well, my soil test says I have 10, or we'll use a bit different. My soil test has 15 pounds per acre phosphorus. Well, my recommendation said I should apply 30. I need 30. So I just take 30 and subtract 15, so I'll apply 15. Those kind of math situations don't work. And that's why you don't see pounds per acre on soil tests very often anymore, because it creates a great deal of confusion. And we'll definitely dive into that next week. What it is an index. It is a measurement of actual concentration, but that number in of itself really doesn't mean anything unless we have data to compare it to. So for example, phosphorus. If I have 15 parts per million phosphorus, I know that I have enough to raise a crop, because I have research backing states that if I have a 15 part per million soil test level, that is the basic level that I need, the minimum. If I'm below that, I need to apply fertilizer. But in and of itself, that 15 means nothing. I sort of liken it to using a tape measure. If I have a tape measure I made myself, has absolutely no relationship to a real inch, and I go measure a board. Maybe I got a broken board on the gate at home, on one of the sheep rams broken board, and I measure it. If I take that same tape measure and I take it to a board and I mark it and I cut that board, it'll be right. However, if I take someone else's tape measure, if they're not standardized, I use a metric tape measure, I use just an eyeball, it's probably not going to fit. And so that's the thing, it's an index. It is relative only to itself, but it is repeatable. If I go back and test that soil in the same spot, in the same conditions, I should get relatively the same result. It shouldn't change dramatically tenfold or 50-fold just because I did it a week later. But it's also going to be directly tied to a fertilizer rate. Research has been done at the universities that says if I have this soil test level using this method of laboratory analysis, and this is my goal, I can definitively identify what fertilizer amount I should apply. And it's real specifically tied back to what's the probability, what's the chances that I'm going to see an increase in yield by doing this. So really, when you think about soil testing, it may not be what a lot of people think it is. It does change over time. Soils are naturally non-uniform, so they're going to vary a little bit. But also, on the other hand, trying to be perfect at soil sampling is virtually impossible. But we can be much more accurate by using it, and if we use it correctly, we can be much more accurate than we do, but I don't know that we'll ever be perfect. And you'll see that as we go through here a little bit today. So what happens when people don't soil test? And these are the kind of situations I get into on a regular basis. It's one of these 5 usually. It's usually the soil test is low, and that's because there's not enough being applied and people continue not to apply enough. It's usually driven by the mindset of the individual. And so they've always put a little bit of fertilizer on every year, and they're going to continue to put very little on. The other situation we run into is the soil test levels are low and they're putting the wrong thing on. Well, they heard that this is good for the soil. They heard that this is a great opportunity, but it doesn't fit the deficiency at hand. This one happens from time to time, and I'm going to show you an example of this. I had an opportunity to purchase a farm a few years ago, and the previous tenant did me a great favor. The soil tests were high, and he kept putting more on. Even though those fertility levels really did not increase his yield, he didn't have any soil tests, he didn't do any comparisons, he didn't do any calculating, he didn't know any different. The good thing is I haven't applied fertilizer to that farm in almost 5 years. I might have to in a couple of years from now, but it's really helping us in these tighter economic times. The soil tests are high, and we're putting on so much, we're still continuing to put on high levels. We may not be able to hold on to it all. Now, a lot of times we hear about phosphorus being an environmental concern, that if our soil test levels are high and we put more on, the soil may not be able to hold on to that. But that's true for any nutrient. I've even could show you examples where potassium, zinc, sulfur leave a field too, because the soil literally cannot hold on to anymore. You've exceeded that sponge's ability to hold on to any more water. In some cases, the nutrient level is high, and additional applications actually make the problem worse. We'll see this from time to time. I had one of my customers do some researching and looking that when soil test phosphorus levels hit a certain spot, yields actually started going down. And so that was a real driver for folks to start thinking that maybe just because a little's good, a lot may not be better. So those are what commonly happen. Unfortunately, all of those have an economic and a lot of them have an environmental potential impact as well. And so let's get into the basics. How do we take a good sample? What do we need to do to get them right? So the first couple of slides here are going to be semi-basic, but I'm going to get into some detail as to why we do these things. And that's where we'll get into some more data-driven slides here. So the first thing is, no matter how I soil sample, I need some basic tools. And it doesn't matter if I am taking one sample for a lawn or a garden, or I'm going out to collect 1,000 acres using the latest GPS technology. I still need these 4 basic things. Now, they may look different based on what I'm doing or how I'm trying to do it, but you still need these basic items. I need some way to collect the sample, and we'll talk about what that sample should look like and how to do it right and wrong. I need a bucket or a collection container. The wrong bucket or collection container can actually cause us problems. We need some way to put something to put that sample in to get it to the laboratory and get it to the laboratory safely so we can get analysis. And we need to take some notes. Soil testing or tissue testing without good field observations has limited value. And so all these things are key. Now, if I'm doing GPS, that soil sampling device could be an automated drone. We have a company we work with that collects samples with XUVs and tracked skid loaders that have no operator station. They are GPS driven, completely autonomous. Or you can take it with a shovel. That same automated company, their field notebook is a GPS system that has sub-inch accuracy in wireless connection to the internet at all locations, or it could simply be some handwritten notes on a piece of paper. It doesn't matter your level of accuracy or what you're trying to accomplish or level of technology, you still need to cover these items. You need to take a good sample, get it to us safely, and keep some information so you know, where was sample one again? I love it when somebody calls me at the laboratory and tries to get me to explain to them, I took 5 soil samples. What's sample one? I don't know. It's sample one. Hopefully you have some notes that says sample one was just west of the driveway or something like that. So the different devices out there, and even the high technology, those automated autonomous machines are going to use one of these concepts for taking a sample. They might be overcomplicated, but it's going to be the same concept. So I'm going to have a probe here. That is the most common, and usually you'll hear called a soil probe. They're actually technically a Hofer tube. They're invented by a gentleman by the name of Hofer. I believe he was German. But what that's unique about that probe is it solves a lot of the problems we have with sampling. And we'll look at it in a moment, but I need a sample that is uniform in volume from the soil surface down to the bottom. If you look at that probe on the left, that is a tube. It's a 3/4 inch diameter normally, sometimes 1 inch. And I need a constant volume of soil at all depths, and I need a consistent depth. So I can put a mark on that probe or put a stop on it to go 6 or 8 inches. And when I press it into the soil, and providing that I press it all the way to the stop or the stop mark, I have a known volume of soil. Inside that tube is a log of soil that is 6 or 8 inches long and 3/4 inch or 1 inch in diameter from top to bottom. I have a known volume of soil at all levels, and I have it to a known depth. The consistency you'll find with soil sampling, the quality of soil sampling comes with consistency. Keep the depth the same each time. Keep your method the same each time. The more you keep the same, the less sampling error you will have. Auger is really the same concept, the picture in the middle, except in this one, we don't have it contained. We're still taking and exhuming a known amount of soil from top to bottom. A lot of times these augers will be placed through a hole in a platform, a sheet of plastic or metal, even the bottom of a bucket, so the loose soil is augered up into a collection item. Soil augers work very good in hard, dry, drouthy soils. Middle of the summer, an auger will work where a tube, a sampling probe is hard to shove into the ground when the ground is hard and dry. So you'll find that agronomists, soil samplers will alternate between the two of them. As you can imagine, if the soil is really wet and almost mud, an auger does not work well. And so both of those are usually the desired methods. The spade and shovel can be used, but you need to do it right. And we'll take a look at that. So I've got a simplistic diagram here. And so it shows my different sampling devices, my auger, my probe, and my shovel. But I want to get my own animation here. I want you to notice some things key in this simple diagram. If you notice in this diagram up top in the shovel, there is a void. If you notice, there is a V-slice of soil missing, and it's laying over here. And that is key, because what you want is uniform volume of soil from the surface to the bottom of your sampling depth. It can be an angle. You're going to get a little more soil, but you want constant amounts at each layer. And I'll show you a slide in a moment here. The reason that is the nutrients in the soil are not uniformly distributed throughout, left and right, nor top to bottom. And so with that being said, there's usually more nutrient at the surface, even under heavy tillage, more nutrients near the surface, because that's where most of your decomposition and organic matter is at. That's where most of your crop residue is at. That's where your fertilizer that you applied is at. and a lot of your manure in a lot of cases. So if we get more surface soil than bottom soil of that trough, we're going to bias it towards that more nutrient rich surface. We will actually increase the soil test. The easiest way to increase the soil test is to sample shallow. The shallower the sample, the higher the soil test will be. The deeper you go, the lower. The key is that the Tri-State University recommendations for Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan are based on a 6 to 8 inch sample depth. So the numbers are calibrated to that sampling depth. It says 6 to 8. I would encourage you to pick 6 or 8, not 6 to 8. The more you do consistently, the less errors you'll have. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove that V slice of soil. And once we have that, we'll discard that soil to the side. And you notice the shovel, the user is taking that shovel and they're taking a slice down the side of that hole. What that's doing is getting uniform amounts of soil from at the top, middle, and bottom of that sample. So now I want you to divert your attention down here to the shovel at the side, and there's a little bit more information there to look at. If we look down here, that shovel is also wider at the top than the bottom. That hole's going to go to a point. So we're basically going to mimic that core or that tube sampler by only taking a slice down the middle of that shovel. It should be about equal thickness from top and bottom of the shovel, and even width. So we have even volume. We'll take that soil that we've collected, we'll put it into a plastic bucket or mixing container and mix it up. Sometimes, depending on your situation, you may not need to do a lot of mixing. I encourage you to send us as much soil as possible, but don't send us a 5-gallon bucket. So if you go around and you take 20 cores randomly in a field and you collect them in a plastic bucket, mix them up, and then subsample that. Take a little bit out of that bucket, just a hand grab, and fill the soil bag. And we'll talk about soil bags in a little bit, but still fill the soil bag up to the line if you have a lab-based bag. If you don't, use a Ziploc. It works. Just use a Sharpie and write the information on it. We need about 2 to 2.5 cups of soil to do a traditional analysis. So if you collect 2 gallons, you need to break that down. What you'll find in a lot of cases in GPS sampling is they don't collect as much soil and they send all of it to us, and they actually avoid that subsampling. It helps reduce some potential sampling error. Minimum of 6 to 8 different places. We call them cores because this core is coming out of the tube predominantly, but we need to do that in at least 6 to 10 places to get a representative sample. And I'll show you again some data in a little bit later that will support why we do that. Buckets are important. Buckets matter. They need to be plastic or stainless steel. If you have galvanized buckets are coated with zinc material. That's why they don't rust. If you test the soil for zinc, which is one of the major nutrients, it will come back high. If you scratch that bucket, you will work some of that zinc off the bucket into the sample, and we'll detect it at the lab. We don't want heavy chemicals. We don't want degreasers, cleaners, anything like that that could contaminate that. You'll find phosphorus in some cleaners and some degreasers. Those things can be picked up in the sample. We had a customer that thought, hey, I'm going to be really, really thrifty, and I'm going to build my own soil probe out of a piece of brass pipe, a copper pipe. Copper is one of the nutrients we test for. He actually showed toxic levels of copper in his sample. The first couple samples he pulled as that soil wore some of the surface copper off of the pipe. So may seem insignificant, but it will add up. So a clean plastic bucket is key. Stainless works, but a plastic usually works the handiest and they're the cheapest. And again, sample bags, I mentioned to fill to the line. So if you use one of our A&L Great Lakes sample bags, there is a line on there specifically to make sure that you have enough soil. If you're a little lower than that or a little higher, it's not that critical. We just don't want to be significantly different. And when we fill that bag up to that line, we're going to have about 3 measuring cups of usable soil for the analysis at the laboratory. But if you don't have bags from us or another laboratory, I know extension offices carry them, ag retailers, they don't have to be ours. I love bags coming in with other companies' logos on them. It doesn't matter. Those bags are specific though. And they're specific in the fact that they are more or less waterproof. They're not good enough to hold water long, but we actually test them in the laboratory. You can fill them with water, set them on the desk, and they'll sit there for about 2 to 3 days before they disintegrate. That's if the sample is wet. It doesn't cause the bag to break down. We had some customers just recently send samples in just a regular lunch bag. And by the time they got here, the bags had ripped and we had 4 samples mixed together in a bunch of shredded paper. We couldn't do anything with them. So we want a Ziploc bag. We want something that's durable, a plastic resealable bag. Well, Ziplocs a brand name. Make sure just to simply write the same information: your name, the farm, field, and sample ID with the Sharpie on that plastic bag. Seal it up tight so it doesn't spill in shipment, and you're good to go. I better clear this off here. And again, take some notes. Jot down in a handbook. If you have electronic devices, you can do GPS sampling, that's fine. But when did you pull the sample? How deep did you pull the sample? And any notes, anything unusual, anything you've observed, because that could be key information in helping somebody you work with or yourself identify a problem, a challenge. It's amazing how useful notes can be. And make sure you know where the samples came from. A quick map or something also is very useful. So when you get those samples ready, you're going to fill out what we call a submittal form. If you're using GPS technology or some of the online sampling apps that use GPS, they will actually give you an option to print out a lab form or something of that nature. And what this form does is it has the key information we need to get the information back to you. You'll find it has an account number if you have one. If not, you don't need one. But if you do business on a regular basis, you have an account number. But we need your name. Who are you and where do we send the data back to? If you would like to have this emailed to you, give us your email address. We'll gladly send it to you. But you also need that reference information: grower or site, farm, field, where did it come from? And the sample ID, the sample, you see on the left side, it says sample number, sample ID, depending on which lab you use or what form, even from us. You'll see south, mid, north. They can be simple as 1, 2, 3. This particular situation was drawn up for south, mid, north. It was a long field and 3 samples were taken, and it gives you some description. You'll see test packages there just to the right. What do you want us to do? And those are listed at the bottom. And if you would like recommendations, you can share that as well. We will gladly do those. We have our own internal, and we can provide you universities. So if you would like the universities, you would simply state down here, and either in the bottom, test information, or next to corn, TS or Tri-State. And that's the monikers for the universities. We have our own. They're a little more aggressive, and it's up to you. But we do need the yield goal and what crop it is so we can make accurate recommendations. And these are just that, recommendations. If you're doing a better job at application, you're more efficient, you can drop below the numbers we provided. We sort of give the worst case scenario numbers. And again, the recommendations, you're welcome to use less than what we even recommend if you would desire to. And so again, I can't stress enough, ship them so that they stay closed, ship them so they don't bounce around. UPS, US Postal Service, FedEx, unless you're delivering them in person, they're not necessarily the friendliest of boxes sometimes. And so we just want to ensure they don't rupture, they don't rip, and they make it to us in one piece. But also be careful for weight. We have some boxes at the lab that are 12 inches square, and they will hold almost 60 samples if you pack them right. They can be upwards of 70 pounds. One, that gets expensive to ship, but 2, that's also just heavy to handle. And so we do want you to be safe. Sometimes a smaller box is a little handier. So I know that's sort of a quick overview, but I want to get into the meat and potatoes of collecting a good sample. This is where you will find the things that will have huge impacts in your sampling error. If you can take and collect a quality sample, the rest of the process will work smoothly. But if we have a junk sample to start with, there's not a lot we can improve. And unfortunately, at the laboratory, we can't tell how you took the sample. If you send us a tissue sample and you send us the wrong part of the plant, say for example, you sent us a corn leaf and we needed the whole plant, we can tell that you did it wrong. Unfortunately, with the soil sample, we can't tell. So we have to encourage you to do it right from the beginning. So some things you want to do. When you select your site to take your sample, you want to carefully remove the residue. You don't have to be super perfect about this. What we don't want is a whole chunk of a corn stalk getting into the end of that probe in your shovel. If it's a small root hair, those kind of things won't happen. Even a corn leaf or a soybean leaf, a segment of it usually isn't an issue because in our lab process, we run these through a flail mill to pulverize them after they've been dried, and it creates an air current. And a lot of light residue, like a leaf particle, actually floats on the air and never makes it into the sample because we screen out large particles as we collect that sample for final analysis. So get the big stuff out of the way. Also, don't dig too deep. If you take your shoe and you sort of take the sole of your boot and you slide to the side, you will actually remove soil if you get too aggressive. And I can show you some numbers. The day I took this picture, I was actually out testing to see what the impact of that was. I actually dropped my soil sample by up to 10% by simply removing too much soil in the process of clearing that residue. So some people get really excited about this. It's not hugely critical. You can probably do more damage by being too aggressive than the impact will be by leaving a little bit of excess residue in the sample. And do not sample directly directly after a manure or fertilizer application. If you get some of that manure or fertilizer in the sample, we will pick it up and it will spike. And especially if it's had a little moisture, even though that fertilizer granule may still be visible, you can't completely avoid it. Our usual recommendation is do not pull a sample for future recommendations for at least 4 to 6 months after a fertilizer application, unless being guided by an agronomist that is going to account for that potential variance. And always, again, consistency is key. Try to remove the same amount of residue or be as aggressive each time you do it. Some other things for sample consistency. I mentioned this once before, can't mention enough. Get the same depth each time. Don't put it at an angle once and straight the other, 4 one time, 8 the other. Keep your sample depth the same each time you sample. 6 is good, 8 is good. We can talk a little bit about 4-inch in no-till. I'm not a big proponent of that, especially as we look at a lot of our no-till operations these days. We're seeing better nutrient movement through worms and other activities that we hadn't seen when a lot of those recommendations were being made. It's not uncommon to see soybeans root upwards of 12 inches deep in no-till today. A lot of those recommendations for only 4-inch sampling were made when soybeans are only maybe rooting 4 to 6 inches in no-till environments. It's a different marketplace today. Keep the same number of cores. If you're going to, if I go to a 10-acre field and I take 10 samples in it, 10 cores, and make 1 sample out of it, do 10 each time. You're going to find anything you can do to keep consistency, the better off you'll be. Do it the same time of year. Again, soil test levels are not static, they change. They are usually the highest in late spring, right before planting, and they are usually the lowest right before harvest. They usually are lower behind corn and wheat than soybeans. So the crop you pull behind, the time of year you pull, are going to have big impacts. And try to do everything you can as consistently as possible, and especially if you get into GPS sampling. When you go to that location to pull the sample, do it the same time every time. Even if it's wrong, be consistently wrong. And do it at the same interval. If you soil sample every 3 years, do it every 3 years. And there's actually some reason to that. And we'll get into it a little bit when we look at fertilizer recommendations, but the Tri-State University recommendations, the new ones I haven't seen yet, they're due out any time, but the current ones we're working on are specific. The recommendations are designed to take you from where your soil test level is now to a target in 4 years. So theoretically, if I have a sample at a given level and say it needs to be built up, and I follow those recommendations, if I do things correctly and everything works correctly as anticipated, I go back and sample in 4 years, I should be very close to that target. So there's a reason why these time intervals are key. I usually recommend once per crop rotation. That keeps you as a guideline because it keeps you behind the same crop. So if you have corn and soybean rotation, do it at 2 or 4 year intervals. If you're wheat, corn, beans, do it in a 3-year interval. You don't have to be, it doesn't have to be a specific crop. You can sample after corn if it fits your logistics, after wheat, after soybeans, whichever it is. Just be consistent. You'll find a lot of times the fertilizer recommendations are a close approximation where you need to be. They're not 100% perfect, because we can't account for all the weather conditions and all the things we can run into in a given growing year, especially if we're applying fertilizer for 2, 3 years. What's going to happen 2 years from now? We don't know completely. And so with that being said, they're very good guidelines. They're good rules of thumb, but there is a bit of flexibility in them. You don't need to apply 5 times more because that will have negative impacts. And so I want to give you some examples and some information to back what I've said so far. So this is a soil test report. I changed the header to protect the guilty, but actually one of my customers actually took this sample for us and allowed me to share it. They took samples at 4 inches deep, and right next to it, within about an inch, they took an 8-inch sample. And here's the results. Again, remember, most of your nutrients are near the surface. So if I look at my organic matter, the stuff we really want, there's a 1% difference when I go deeper. Phosphorus, when I went deeper, it cut my soil test phosphorus in half. But remember, the recommendations are based on that 8-inch sample. Potassium, roughly 1/2. Soil pH, a lot of times does not vary as much as one would think, but usually pH is an oddity. It goes up in a lot of Northeast Indiana with depth. Our soils are based on, or the parent material of our soils are calcium carbonate, limestone, lime. Lime is what causes pH to go up, and that's underneath our soil. So we usually find when we get into closer to bedrock, closer to parent material, our pH goes up. So I just want to share with you, that's why depth is important. If you pick some and pull some samples at 4, next time you go pull it at 8, next time you pull it at 6, it's going to be really hard to figure out where your fertility program is going because the numbers are going to move. And that's okay. Consistency will solve that for you. So number of samples, how many do I take? Question comes in a lot. The first question is, how big of the area are you trying to sample? We recommend no more than 20 acres per sample. Are there defined regions? Is the field L-shaped, or the yard or the garden, and there's a left leg and a main? If you got definitive areas, or maybe that leg was added 10 years later, if it's distinctively different, sample them separately. But also keep in mind, how small of an area will you be willing to fertilize? So I'm working with a neighbor here. They're just getting into farming, and they've got 8 acres for me to farm in 3 fields. I don't know that I'm going to sample each of those fields separately because I don't know that I'm going to get a different fertilizer spread for each one of those. And those are reality. I could sample all 8 together and do one blanket, but then I don't know if there are differences between those individual segments. So those are the answers I need to answer for myself before I take the sample. And past management. Again, if that garden was expanded and it's twice as big now, and you added that extra area to your garden this past just 2 years ago, you may consider sampling them separately. How has the older garden behaving different than the new garden? You could see some significant variances, especially if you've been working hard to manage it. In history, if you've sampled it one way in the past and you saw some good information, continue to sample it in that same manner. Again, consistency. So you want, again, as I mentioned before, at least 6 cores for each area. And that could be a GPS point, that can be a GPS zone, that could just simply be a region of the field. So if you look at the simplistic diagram here, there's a waterway going through the field. Stay away from the waterway. Right close to it, you can see some oddities, especially if the waterway was just built or constructed recently. And you might also find some variances right close to it because of fertilizer application. Maybe you're not spreading as close to that waterway and keeping the fertilizer out. And it's going to drop off the last 5 or 6 feet. It's okay. You can let it go. Stick 5 to 10 feet away from the edge. Avoid old building sites. You might actually consider, like on the bottom of that diagram, separating the field by high and low ground. Again, it'll give you the variance, but you may or may not apply differently. So here's why we do at least 6 cores. This was a simple study by Dr. Miller, and I use it a lot. What they did is they took soil samples in a 10-foot radius away from a single point. They basically put a circle on the ground and randomly took samples, and and what I mean by sample, they took an individual core, and they analyzed just that core, that single point. And they did a 6-inch sample. This is out in Iowa, where they do promote 6-inch samples more consistently, but that's fine. The message is the same. Look within a 10-foot circle. Look at how much difference you got. Location 1 was 15 parts per million. Location 2 was 30, double. Location 3 went back down. So if you look at a variance, you have about 13 as a minimum, but 30 as a high point. But if you notice, there's only 130. So what's the chances that you're going to hit that one spot? And what's the chances of that biasing your soil sample? And that's where what Bob did was pretty interesting. He took those samples and he said, if I only take 2, if I go out there and I pull a sample and I happen to, oops, jumped out of there, hit my wrong button. What they did is, okay, what happens if I only get 2 of those? What are all the possible combinations I could get? So if he only took 2 of those 12 samples, there's 66 possible combinations of the data to the left. That means the minimum average he could get is 13. The highest average he get was 25. He could have a 2-fold difference in the data depending on which points he hits. Now let's look at 6. By taking any possible combination of the 6, the lowest I could get is 14. The highest I can get is 19. I have cut that variance between the possibilities in half. But if you get really carried away, the numbers don't change that much. Okay, I'm going to go take 8. The bottom came up a little bit. The top came down, but not by much. And what you find is once you get up about 6 to 8 cores to make up that sample, the variance the reduction of variance doesn't necessarily pay for the extra effort. Of course, this is looking at a very small area. So if you're sampling 20 acres, you definitely want to get a few more cores, but you'll find at 6 to 8 cores, it will blend out the extreme highs and lows in the resulting data. And again, just taking some more error out of the picture. What can we do to make it come in a little more consistent each time? So time of year, here's why we do it. This was some data from Dr. Peck. He collected data for 10 years. Every 2 weeks, he sampled a field for 10 years. The man is dedicated. I try to pull samples in a field 5 times a year and I struggle. But what you see is it moves. This is potassium. We were looking at phosphorus before. This is potassium, but it moves. Potassium is highest usually in the spring, as you see in April, and it will decline through the growing season as the crop takes it up. And then once it gets to harvest, the plants start dying. They start releasing potassium. Potassium will begin releasing from the soil to replace that lost material to equilibrate. And by early winter, we're at a peak. And then when we get to the following spring, we see that decline again. And so we see that seasonal oscillation. And okay, how much is it? And so I actually took some of that data I pull on my farm, and here is the spring versus fall variation in potassium for the past 5 years in southern Allen County, Indiana. Now, granted, this is one field, one soil. It's actually all one soil type, but it's in 3 different fields, one farm. The samples are all within about 1,000 feet of each other. But if you notice, field 2 here in 2012, the spring of 2012 versus the fall of 19 here, it was only 1 part per million difference. Now that's a pretty good time frame. However, if I look at field 3, just a couple hundred feet away, it's 7 part per million off, but we're still well less than 10%. We're about 5%. But some years you will see big variances. Here's an 11% variability between the fall of 18 and the spring of 19. And these are very accurately pulled. They are consistent depth. All of these samples have been pulled in the past 7 years within 1 foot of a known point. So they're pretty gosh darn consistent. So Mother Nature will have some play. If we look back into 15 and 16, there was about a 12% difference. So if I pull in the fall consistently, usually it is lower than the spring, but not always. So there's some things we can't control. We just have to do the best we possibly can. So I want to get into sampling methodologies a little bit here. So as we get into GPS and technology, you'll hear a big debate and argument about, do I do grids? Do I do zones? What do they look like? So I want to give you some fundamentals. So this is I apologize. This is a grid sample. Now, what you'll see is there are soil types underlying. The different colors are the soil types in this field. But if you know, the sample points are pulled in a very definitive pattern. They're on a grid pattern. There's no adjustment made for what you might say common sense. Wherever they fall by geometry is where they stay. What this does is it takes the human nature out of it. Well, I don't want it there because that might be different. It takes the bias out. It's cold, but it's calculated. And so that's the value of grid soil samplings. It takes any biases out, what you think might be there. But we know, like we look at that soil type picture, soil variability doesn't happen in these patterns. So with that being said, what the challenge is that we have here is anytime we take soil samples, we're making an assumption, and that's hard for people to understand. So if I take a soil sample based on this geometric pattern, I'm assuming that that arbitrary dropping of points is going to give me a feel or mathematical understanding of the variability in the field. We know the field is not uniform, but we assume it doesn't matter. That sounds a little hard to swallow. So the perfect thing is I'm going to go to a zone. I'm going to pull my samples within the soil type and keep those soil types separate. But you're still making assumptions. You're assuming, so if we look at that green olive color top zone 1, we're assuming that that zone is uniform. That soil type yields the same. We're assuming the soil type map is correct. And I'll show you many of them that aren't. We're also assuming that that zone has always been managed the same. So what happens if that field used to be 5 fields and somebody took the fence rows out? And maybe there was zone 1 spread across 3 fields 20 years ago. Will they be truly uniform today? And sometimes we don't know that until we dig into the data. But both of them have their benefits. Management zones do reflect natural environmental changes in the field, but we're still making assumptions. No soil sampling is perfect, but if you think about it, if this is a 100-acre field, I had a customer call me the other day. He had taken one sample based on 6 cores taken out of 108 acres. I would argue that either of these methods are better than one sample in 108 acres. So I'm going to jump in a couple of things because of the essence of time. So I apologize for sliding through, but I want to continue this concept into some key levels. And we'll jump back into this next week, the few slides that I'm jumping over. So what is soil sampling cost us? A lot of people say, I can't do it because it's too expensive. I say horse hockey. Of course I do. I'm a salesman in a laboratory. I want samples. But no, let's look at the details. So what I did is I'm going to bare my soul here. I am a bad farmer. Anybody that's ever talked to me knows that I am, and I will share anything with you just to prove to you how bad I am. These are my actual corn production numbers for 2018. I'll put it right out in front of you. Here's what it cost me to produce an acre of corn on average in my operation. And so you can see the numbers there. It's probably no surprise. Land is always your most expensive. Fertilizer is number 2, with the seed coming in 3rd. And so it costs about $500 to $600 minimum to put out an acre of corn. Which one of those are impacted by soil testing? My land value is going to be impacted, because if it's good fertility, I may pay more cash rent, or I may have greater value when I look at it on my balance sheet. It's going to have some control over how much nitrogen I apply. Maybe not direct, but it's going to definitely impact my phosphorus and potassium applications. It might impact what seed I choose. It definitely can impact what herbicides I use. And my crop insurance might be affected based on my yields. So I'd argue that most all of that cost is impacted, at least indirectly, by soil sampling. So what does soil sampling cost? What I did is I took list price, no discounts, straight across the board. So if you take a whole field composite, you go out yourself and you take a sample of a field every 20 acres, and you do it every 4 years, do the bare minimum, it's going to cost you on average 10 cents per acre per year over those 4 years. 10 cents. 0.02% of your overall expenses. Not a whole lot. So I'm going to go down through and I'm going to get to a GPS. I'm going to hire somebody to sample it every 4 years on a 2.5 acre grid. Get some intensive sampling out there. I'm going to generate a lot of samples. And it's going to cost me about $1 to $2, $1.50 to $2 a year, less than 0.25%. Folks say they can't afford it. I'm going to get real aggressive here. I'm going to do every 2 years on 1 acre grids. I'm going to go to the max. No way you can afford that. It costs less than 1% of your annual expenses to do that. But what is it impacting? So what is it truly impacting? So that whole field composite that cost me 10 cents an acre to take is impacting or directing. It is identifying upwards of $5,500 of fertilizer application in those 4 years. So if I do that one sample wrong, it could impact up to over $5,000 worth of input costs. What you do when you go to more intensive sampling is you reduce your risk. And that's really a lot of times we're doing in fertility management is reducing the risk potential for loss. So if we go to a 2.5 acre grid that we hire every 4 years, sort of the base minimum for precision ag, that one sample is only going to influence $679 worth of fertilizer. We cut our risk of a incorrect sampling or a sampling bias significantly. If I go down to 1 acre grid every 2 years, it's only impacting $135 of fertilizer. So if I do one wrong, the impact is virtually negligible. And so cutting short in time, there's 1 or 2 examples I want to share with you in precision ag. I'm a big fan of it. I use it myself. And again, this is one of my fields. If you see where that 6.5x is, that's sampling point number 3 of the fall versus spring applied. And so I just simply benchmark one grid point in the field. And so this is how pH varies. And we looked at P and K. Let's look at pH for a moment. My wife is an agronomist, and she went out with a hand probe and she pulled samples. She does a great job. But I wanted her to do it rather than myself because I did not want to bias the sample. I knew how the field laid out. I look at the fertility quite closely. And she randomly pulled the sample and we analyzed it, and that's the result at the top. That composite soil sample, she did one for a 35 acre field. I know that's all wrong, but that's how the previous farmer was doing it. The sample came back with a pH of 6.1, and it recommended 1.2 tons of lime. And that was going to take 42 tons of lime to cover that field. Not bad. I mean, within reason. That same field on a 2.2 acre grid, I did that because it's log shaped. They range from 5.7 to 7.6. And the reason this is important is anything below about my target is a 6.5. My target is 6.5, but I don't put lime on because of abilities to apply. The Tri-State University recommendations say don't put on lime until it's about 6.2, 6.3. You need to be a little bit underneath before you can pull that trigger. So if you look at this field, how many of those data points are below 6.1 to 6.2? Not that many of them. So if I look at this recommendation as generated by the GPS, average is 6.2, the composite was 6.1, the average is very close. But when I variable rate that line, I only need to apply 28 tons using the same mathematical recommendation structure because I'm looking at smaller parts of the field. And so that's where the dollars come in. So if it costs me less than $2 an acre to save almost 20 tons of lime and application costs and trucking, it makes some sense. And this is something you can hire done or do yourself. There are a lot of opportunities. So I want to look at a real realistic expectation with soil sampling and why this can come into play. And this is the same field looking at a different software package for phosphorus. And the reason I'm looking at this one is we do have an environmental concern on this field. This field is from a former livestock facility. It had different paddocks, and you can actually see the remnants of the different fields. If you notice, the green and the yellow are the higher numbers, and those were the areas where the livestock fields were. This field was actually cut into many smaller pieces in previous years. And so historically, we have applied uniform fertilizer across this field before we went into GPS. The areas in yellow in orange and red need phosphorus fertilizer. Sort of the target, if I'm raising corn and beans, my target, if you see up on the side there, is a 50 to 30 part per million. If I go to wheat, I need a little higher phosphorus. I'm looking at 25, 40. Again, we'll get into these details next week. But I want to put in some parameters for you. So if you look at that, those areas that are in green, if I use tri-state recommendations for corn and beans, should not have any fertilizer applied to them. They should not have any potassium, phosphorus, pardon me, I misspoke. They should have no phosphorus applied. They don't need it. And there's some more things to think about. These areas where we have the highest numbers are also the lowest yielding. If you look at the yield maps, they give us the lowest yield. Still working on that. But if you notice, my high phosphorus levels are in these odd shaped areas. That area is very hard to farm. And if I go out and spread, or my ag retailer, I should say, spreads with a 90-foot spreader, they can't do it easily. They're overlapping. They're making pie shapes. They're doing double applications. It's just not easy to do. And so we get more fertilizer in that area as well. This area has a tendency to flood. If I look at this bottom left corner here, that is in a depression. It has high. It's a floodplain. That curved part of that field is actually a ditch. Is a large, a maintained ditch, and so we're sitting in a situation where I have a area that has high fertility levels, does not need any more fertilizer, doesn't yield well most years because it gets flooded. What do you think happens if I apply fertilizer and A, flooding occurs, or two, it's simply more, and we don't get the crop to remove it and consume it? Our risk for loss is much greater where that 51 and 40 and even that 46 is on that left side of the field because of the land positioning. And these are some things where we can start having a positive impact both on our financials and environmental by adopting some of this technology. Is it perfect? No. I can show you areas where this field, there's errors. That pattern may not be right, but I think it's better than doing just a blind whole field. And then this is a picture of the other farm that I dearly love. Again, any number above about 40 to 45 does not need phosphorus applied. This was this past year. I pulled samples in that field that I've been farming for a couple of years from another farmer that didn't quite watch his fertility. The good thing is I haven't put fertilizer on that field other than that red and a couple of orange spots. About 7 acres of that field out of 30 is the only part that's seen phosphorus fertilizer in the past 5 years. Given today's grain prices, it makes life a little bit easier. So, and we'll quit on the examples there. I'm going to go to questions. I apologize for going just a few minutes over, but I want to get those examples in and try to set the stage as to what can be done. And so with that, I think we're probably time for some questions.
So if anybody has any questions, you guys can go ahead, unmute yourself and ask Jamie your question. I do believe we have some poll questions coming up. So all you have to do for the poll questions are just click on the answers that most relevant to you. And they are up now. If you also don't have audio, so you can ask questions, you can go ahead and type them in the chat box and we will be able to ask the questions for you.
I did such a great job, Lindsay.
You did, Jamie.
That are completely baffled. And if questions come up, we're going to be doing this next week. Yep. I will gladly address them, or get a hold of one of the coordinators, and they can get them to me. I'll be glad to address it. There's a lot of producers that work with this, and a lot of even small specialty growers that work with it and struggle with some basic questions. And I'm concerned that when you read the internet, a lot of the information you get out there isn't necessarily 100% accurate. So by all means, please ask the question and we can have a conversation on it.
Yes. All right, we'll give you guys just a few more moments to get the poll questions filled out. Anybody has any questions, you guys can go ahead and type in the chat box or unmute yourselves. Otherwise, we'll move on shortly. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead. I don't see any questions yet. If you guys somehow generate one, you guys can go ahead and type it in the chat box. We'll have another QA session in a little bit, but we're gonna go ahead and move on to Olivia with Indiana Department of Environmental Management, and she's gonna be talking about some manure regulations. Thank you, Jamie.
Hi, everyone. As Lindsay said, I am Olivia. I work for the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. Let me share my screen with you here. All right, so as she said, I'm going to be going over kind of our manure regulations, what we follow in our rule. So I work for the confined feeding permit section within the Office of Land Quality for IDEM. I am one of the permit writers. We have 4 sections within the state. I cover the Northwest section. But yeah, so we'll go ahead and get started here. So just kind of, if you're not familiar with our program, if you're not in our program, we have 3 laws, rules that we kind of follow, or not kind of follow, we do follow. The first is the confined feeding control law, the confined feeding operation rule, and the NPDES permit rule. That one in the middle there, 327 IAC 19, is what I'm going to be discussing today, and what everything I reference is going to be based on. That's what all of our permits currently operate under. The state of Indiana doesn't have any NPDES permits currently, so that doesn't really come into effect at the moment. So under that rule, there's a specific manure definition for everything that falls when we're going to discuss manure. So as you can see on the list here, obviously liquid or solid animal excreta, but then also you have any liquid waste that's generated at the facility. So that includes, drinking water, that cleanup water, any water that comes off of a truck or trailer wash that's on the facility, the wastewater and the wash water out of the milking parlor, water used to wash eggs, and silage leachate that's coming off of your silage pad. And then included in that is precipitation or surface water that might come into contact with those. So if you have rain coming in and getting in contact with those, that falls under our manure regulation. So that's important to think about, as a lot of people, just consider manure, straight manure, and don't consider all of these other factors that come into play with it. So kind of an overview of our land application of manure. This is for a CFO operation that is applying on land that they own. So we have the manure sample. You need to know the nutrient content of your manure and everything I kind of mentioned previously. And we focus on the nitrogen and phosphorus of that sample. The rate, you need to know obviously how much manure is being applied, and it must be applied at an agronomic rate for the crops you're planning to plant based on your nutrients that you know, and following our setbacks. And then all the records you have to keep within your operating record of how you're land applying, where you're land applying, how much, and we'll get into that in just a second. So for the manure management plan, this is required for all of our permits, whether you are a brand new CFO, getting a CFO approval for the first time, or whether you're renewing your farm, that you've had for 35 years. We require it every time. It includes how you're going to soil test, how you plan on testing your manure. We need your soil survey maps of the land application areas, If it's the first time, if it's a brand new CFO approval area, we require the topo maps of your land application areas. If you are marketing and distributing manure rather than applying yourself, there's a waiver that must be submitted in order to do that. And if there's some other alternate method that you're deciding to use, we need to know about that as well. So how we define our soil manure test here, for the soil test, it needs to provide enough information about the fertility of the soil to know the nutrients that you need to apply so that you're not over applying. And then for the manure test, they go hand in hand. You need to know what's in your manure that you're applying so that you can do that at an agronomic rate. So what we need in the operating record, it's all provided when an application is approved in what we call the record book. This is what our compliance inspectors look at during a routine inspection. They're going to check all of these records. The record book, or the operating record, does include more than what I have listed here, but I just focused on what is related to manure. So that manure management plan, what I just went over, that should be in the operating record. Your emergency response plan, if a spill were to happen, and any documentation if you've had a spill. And then the calculation for minimum acreage for the amount of manure you're going to be producing. The land use agreements, if you're planning on, or sorry, if you don't own the land you'll be applying on, and then the land application records for every piece of land that you are applying that manure on. So this is our emergency spill response plan, just as an example of kind of what we're going to be putting in that operating record. This is important. We have all of the contact information. Well, first at the top, you can see the farm information. This is important when contacting us. It's easier to find a farm if we know the farm information numbers, and then the contact information, who owns the farm, who manages the farm, if that's a different. And then you have your other contacts towards the bottom, your counties, your IDIM inspector, and of course the IDIM spill line, who you need to contact if a spill were to happen. This form is your manure application record. This is what needs to be filled out during each land application event. We recommend that each field or area that you're applying to have its own form, as it's easier to kind of keep track and document that way. As you can see, it says field ID up at the top. That's how you're going to recognize your field, whether it's numbered or labeled as a farm name. However, it's pretty self-explanatory. If you read the grid across, you can see we need to know the date when you applied this manure, your manure source. So if you have multiple barns or multiple lagoons and you are only pulling manure from one area, we want to know, or if there's multiple, we want to know which buildings or lagoons it was being taken from, the amount applied, the amount of acres you applied to, the nitrogen and phosphorus information from your manure test, your method of application, then you have your pounds of nitrogen and phosphorus that were applied per acre. Another important thing we look for is the precipitation events. We don't want an overly saturated ground to be having manure applied to it. So has it rained 24 hours before, during, or after that application? And then the comments is another important part. You know, is field sloped? Are there other factors that play into how you're applying to this field? So like I said, this needs to be filled out for each field each time manure is applied. So if the land that's being applied on is not owned by the CFO, that you must have a land use agreement that is signed by the landowner or the person responsible for that property, saying that they are allowing you to apply manure to their land. How we figure our minimum acreage requirements, this takes into account the nutrient content of the manure and the field nitrogen and phosphorus needs based on what crops you're going to be planting. These should be figured out, you know, after you've had your manure tested. You can accurately predict what the minimum acreage requirements are going to be. As a general estimate on how IDEM figures minimum acreage, we use the table on the right there. It's basically an average of nitrogen per acre is what it's based on. You can, you just take your number of animals on the farm, divide it by the number you see in the table based on what kind of manure it is, and you will get your minimum acreage requirement that we look for. So this is an example of a land use agreement. This isn't a required, you don't have to use this exact form, but more or less this has the information that we need if you want to type up your own. So we need the landowner, the producer, the location of where the field is, and how many acres are going to be applied to there. We also want the term of the agreement, and then as you'll see at the bottom, both the producer and the landowner need to sign and agree to this form. When land applying, there are setbacks that we require you to follow. These are based on the Indiana NRCS Conservation Practice Standard number 633. These are based on what type of application you're doing. So as you can see, we have injection, surface application, incorporation. It just, they do vary a little bit. So this is important. If you have, we get a lot of questions and comments from adjoining landowners saying, you know, this farmer is spreading manure in the field behind my house and he seems really close to my property, you know, how close can he get? And if they know what type of application you're doing, it's easy to tell them, you know, you can, there's no setbacks for liquid injection to property lines, so you can apply right up to the property line. So that's important to communicate with people so they know that you are applying as the rule states and you're not doing something you shouldn't be. For land application to frozen or snow-covered ground, we do allow this if the farm is a CFO with less than 120 days of manure storage. They can request this. That is a separate approval from our general CFO approval. CFOs in that mid-range with more than 120 days but less than 180 days need to propose some sort of alternative design approach in order to show that they are able to control applying to frozen or snow-covered ground. If a farm is CAFO sized, they are not allowed to apply manure to frozen or snow-covered ground under our rule. And CFOs are not approved anymore with 120 days or less. You currently have to have 180 days of storage to get a new approval. These farms that only have 90 days of storage, less than this 120, are farms that have been grandfathered into our program. They've been in the program for many years before our current rule took place, so they've been grandfathered in. So we do offer this if they need to use it. There have been instances when there is a need for emergency application to frozen or snow-covered ground. This is based on things, if some sort of natural disaster or major weather event occurs, if some sort of damage happens, that's out of the producer's control, we normally will allow, in certain instances, for you to apply to frozen and snow-covered ground. We obviously don't want the manure spilling out of a pit or a lagoon, so this is a better and safer option. You do have to contact IDEM. The fastest way is through the spill line to get a hold of them, and then have this filled out so that we can kind of backwards approve you applying to frozen and snow-covered ground. So marketing and distributing of manure is an acceptable manure management practice under our rule. Anyone is eligible to request an acreage waiver, whether or not you're new or an existing operation. If it is an existing farm, you can get this waiver approved by providing us with 3 years of the records of distribution that you've kept track of, or a contract must be provided showing the agreement of someone to take either all or a percentage of the manure from your facility. This agreement, if you're doing a contract, it must last at least for the period that our approvals last for. An IDEM CFO approval is good for 5 years. So in order to have a contract to market and distribute your manure, that contract must also last for at least the 5-year period of your approval. So this is an example that we provide as how to keep your manure distribution records. Like I said before, you don't have to follow this exact page, but this is the information we require. We need to know the date, where you're taking the manure and who it was received by, the address of the location you delivered it to, or it was being taken to, and then how much and what kind of manure was being distributed. So this is the form that should be provided to the recipient of the manure you're distributing. It provides your nutrient content after you've tested your manure so that they know what they're expecting and what they are able to do with it. It also shows some application restrictions down at the bottom, but anyone receiving manure should have some sort of applicator's license through the Office of the State Chemist in order to do something with that manure. Some additional information here that we often get questions on. Your land application is not limited to the acreage that you provide with an approval. So if if your minimum acreage requirement is only, you only need 200 acres, but you own 1,500 acres, you don't have to provide us maps and information on all of those 1,500 acres when you apply to the program, but you do have to keep track of where you're applying that manure. Some people like to say, there's not a field in Indiana that you can't apply manure to. As long as you have the permissions and you keep the records and information in your operating manual, you can basically put manure more or less wherever you want. And also, if you provided us with the records or the contract to market and distribute your manure, you are still allowed to land apply manure. It's just, we just need to know that the manure is being taken care of, that you have the ability to handle all of the manure that's going to be produced within that year. So if you tell us that you marketed 100% of it, but you ended up land applying to, you know, the field around the farm, again, that's fine. You just need to provide the requirements, the maps, the records within your operating manual. Everything needs to be, all land application must be recorded. We need to know where that manure is going, who's taking it, or which fields it's ending up on. So, and if in doubt ever, you can call us and ask, whether it's calling my department, the permitting section. We can generally answer questions. We're very good at kind of the setbacks and that information. And then our compliance inspection group is very good at asking or answering more specific land application questions, because they're the ones that are out in the fields inspecting the records at each specific farm. So like I said, we have our compliance inspections. This is kind of an overview of what our inspectors do when they go out and they visit a farm. You can see on there, they're going to review land application, they're going to review the emergency response plan, and any other types of practices that are required under that approval. So these reviews, routine inspections happen every 5 years. So once during every approval period, this inspection will happen. And they are going to look at all of those maps, all of the records, everything that I've went over. That's what they're inspecting, in addition to obviously the buildings and that sort of thing. That is all I have over our manure regulations. Here's my contact information. If anybody has any questions in the future and needs to contact us, feel free to do so.
Thank you so much, Olivia. Again, if any of you guys have questions for Olivia, you guys can go ahead, unmute yourselves, or type a question in the chat box. We'll give you guys a few minutes to do that. So yeah. All right, I'm seeing nothing popping up in the chat box. So thank you, Olivia. Our next speaker is going to be Brad. He's going to be doing his PARP topic now. And so Brad, I'm going to turn the screen over to you now.
All right. How's my sound?
Sounds good.
Good. Too loud or not?
Sounds perfect from over here.
All right. Hopefully we made a little bit of improvement from last week, I guess. Got a little headset going on, so hopefully you can hear a little bit better. So, hey, it's good to see everyone, or at least talk to everyone again. It seems like it's been one of those, this has definitely been a different year. Without, I'm sure you guys hear that every day, I know, but from Purdue standpoint, it's been, it's just been, every day's been interesting and unique as we went through this spring and stuff like that. I guess I gotta admit, it's just been odd because I haven't talked to a lot of farmers and a lot of people. Like I say, we've all been kind of shut down and things like that for the longest time. Generally, I know fair did happen, but obviously, like most fairs, we didn't have everyone there. And so I know normally we see everyone at the fair, even the state fair. Just got back from that, and pretty good, but it was really different. I mean, when you can walk down Main Street and hear a pin drop, it's pretty interesting. So I know yesterday I was down in Danville and Master Farmers. That was one of the first, and even some of the pretty people that were there, they said, man, this is like the first event we've had since like March. But we had a Master Farmer ceremony. If you don't know much about that, we always hold that in conjunction with the Farm Management Tour, but the Farm Management Tour was discontinued. And I know I have a lot of Adams County folks online here, and so these names may sound familiar, but Max Beer and Dave Summers both were recipients of that this year. I kind of nominated them for the Master Farmer Award, and so I know we're going to have some more publicity coming out, but that was just pretty cool to hear them talk, and just to have an extension event again yesterday was pretty unique as far as that goes. They really talked a little bit about some of the problems we got in agriculture right now, and obviously some of the political mess we're in and things like that, but it was really a lot of wisdom and a lot of good things shared there. I know I just wanted to share also with you, I know there was a back home farm in Rensselaer, Colehagen Farms. We hosted Senator Braun actually yesterday morning, first thing in the morning. They had a breakfast tool shed meeting, and there again, it wasn't doom and gloom, but it wasn't exciting either, because I know a lot of you have concerns about the markets and where things are going. His famous words kind of resonated with me a little bit, talking about China and saying how he's like, we'll take what China can give us right now, and we're just not really sure about the future on some things. And so there's a lot of big question marks, especially when we got some good, decent yields out there. I know we need rain. We've obviously been in a little bit of a drought, so rain can only help us at this point, especially the beans. So again, thanks for attending this little event. We'll kind of move on to some of our main topics here as far as that goes. If you don't know, the State Chemist Office website is continuing to be updated. I don't know how to say this, but they're trying. If you got on there and try to figure out some of your credits, most of them are correct, but they switched over to a new company. I know I get a lot of calls, a lot of questions about credits, and those people, like I say, most of you are on here tonight, need some type of credit. So I'm just letting you know, they tried to do a new website, and that internet company left them in the middle of it, and now they're just kind of reeling from it. I don't know where they're going, but they do know that things are just not great with it. So I'm trying to keep most of you, at least in my county, are updated on where your credits are and what you got going. I know most of you are in really good shape. We had a lot of that dicamba workshops here when that dicamba thing happened two years ago. I mean, we had everyone attend those. Last year we had quite a few. So most people, at least in Adams County, are in pretty good shape credit-wise as far as that goes. Also, I was going to go over here real quick. I know Lindsay's taking care of CCHs and the crop advisors and that type of stuff. And so I know she's got that list going. I'm handling more of the PARP pesticide applicators. And so I'm going to go through my list real quick and call out names that because I've chatted with some of you and did a little bit of chat to make sure we got everyone. I know last week too, I did the same thing, and I got everyone that actually paid on my list, and they're online too. So I'm supposed to double check all that. So I'm just going to run through. These are the names that I actually have that have paid I have down getting a credit. Okay. So I'm not, and so I don't steal everyone's thunder and call out all your personal information. I'm just going to use your first name. I got a Gene, Eric, Stephen, Kenneth, and then I got two Kents. I got a Kent L and a Kent K. I have a Doyle, Mark, Daniel, Troy, John, Roger, James, Charlie, and then I got a Richard R and a Richard S. So I think that's all my part people. I guess you got from now until the end, and I got my email here in the slides as far as that goes. If you want to email me, if you think something's messed up, I don't want to exclude anyone, but those are the people as of right now that are getting a PARP credit. If I called your first name, I got you down that you've checked in here, and you've also paid $15 online. I know I have tackled some phone calls about that whole $15. And again, it's your choice. I explained this last week a little bit, but I continue to get some questions of why $15. No, that price didn't necessarily go up. I know everything has with the COVID. I get that. So it seems like, wow, what happened now? Now we got to charge 15. But Purdue kind of set that for this virtual system right now. I don't know if it'll go down to $10 or if it'll go higher. I have no idea. But that's one thing they kind of set in stone for a virtual program. I don't know. I know it's always been 10, and if we still have face-to-face meetings, the way I understand it, we're still charging $10. But the virtual thing is something I feel like we had to have the extra $5 because it's CVent that you registered through, and that's what they're trying. It's all online, collecting the money and distributing the money and things like that. So because we have to use CVent for this, that's where we get the extra $5 basically. So that's why it's the increase. There's been some people like, well, I'm not going to do that. And I'm like, hey, that's fine. We can wait for a face-to-face or something like that. But right now, that's the best thing we got going. This is for those guys that I've had a lot of calls this year. What are you doing credits? And I'm like, what are we doing for part programs and things? And I'm like, man, you just keep hoping things get better week after week, month after month. And I don't know, it just more and more now they're kind of saying, Purdue is really saying we're supposed to stay virtual, no face-to-face meetings really throughout the rest of the year. So just a heads up there. Most of you, like I say, are from Adams County. At least I'm hosting this in Adams County. Adams County people are in pretty good shape. I just had a handful that really needed a credit. So, and some of you like this. I'm not going to lie. We're learning a lot through this COVID thing, and there's been a lot of really good things, and you probably hear that just on the outside looking in, but our administrators in Purdue has been like really pleased with some of the changes we have made. And the state chemist office for the longest time, even here in June and stuff, they're like, no, we're not going to go virtual. We're not going to go virtual. And once we did here, I'm afraid it's going to be hard to go back. I'm not saying we're getting rid of face-to-face PARPs and eating. I always try to feed people at some of my PARP meetings and things like that and have a meal and socialize, and that's all part of it. So we're not doing away with that by no means, but I think we're going to integrate a lot of virtual and virtual opportunities now. That's something we've never gone before. And a lot of farmers are saying, hey, I got a smartphone. I can sit in a tractor and literally listen to this. So it's pretty cool as far as that goes. So yeah, hopefully we'll just see how this thing goes, but I'm trying to answer a lot of questions moving forward about this. Pick and choose. Some of you that signed up on CVent, you probably saw there's a whole other, all our Purdue field days have gone online now where you can do them virtually. I had one complimentary. If you didn't need a PARP, you could actually just log in, and then those that did that and went through CVent, it was $15 for a PARP. You could check which box. And so the other, you can sign up for as many as you want there. Those are all on that website right now. Purdue's kind of housing those in a one site type of deal. So feel free to, like I say, on this call, I do have some out of county. You can get them from anywhere you want in the state. You can attend a PARP session. So it's not like you have to only go to your own county. So these are wide open for anyone. We do have this, our series concluding next week. I'm sure Lindsay will remind you of that at the end here. But that's going on. We'll conclude next week with kind of more about soil results and reading those and understanding a few more, probably more technical questions on that side. So hopefully we've enjoyed. Some of you have been attended last week and this week, and some of you signed up for next week. So that's pretty cool that we got a couple people back as far as that goes. So. I'm going to try to share my screen here. So, all right. So, we'll move on to my presentation here, and like I say, we'll wrap up here pretty good shape. We're running ahead of schedule here, so that's why I'm maybe talking going a little bit more in detail. I'm just trying to make sure I got all those things covered. Again, if you have any questions about the PARP stuff, let me know. This slide here, each program, if you don't know and you're new and different things, they're given a program number, okay? And so you read this here, and basically 37 means it's only we're already in August, and it's the only 37th PARP program we had. So there have not been that many in the state of Indiana, to let you know a little bit. It's been slow going this year to pick up some of these. But I know there's quite a few here at the end now. Like I say, winter here and fall, I think a lot more are going to go online. Okay. But those are just reminders. Most of you know this. You need 3 PARPs in 5 years, no more than 2 PARPs in 1 year. They want you to kind of spread them out. Let's see, I'm trying to think, like I say, they say encourage keeping your program number so you know, especially till we get through this transition period with the state chemist office, trying to figure out how many credits everyone has and things. And your certification's good for 5 years, okay? So I always try to go over those things a little bit. My email's down there. Most of you should have it now anyway. I've emailed most of you, but if you have questions and things, feel free to always fire an email to me and we'll go from there, okay? Gotta get back where I can click on. Okay. Here, again, I want to thank Jamie. I know I think he's still on, it looks like, but thank Jamie for going in on this and helping out through A&L Labs and telling us a little bit about his expertise. I know I grew up with him and competed him in FFA quite a bit and everything. It's amazing how much I thought probably both of us, we did soil judging, crop judging, and things like that, and we thought we knew a lot. But I know I've learned a lot on my job, and it's pretty cool to hear all the stuff he has really learned over the years working at his job. That's for sure. He's given me a thumbs up even. But again, like he's kind of saying, and we've been alluding to fact, I tell a lot of people, I help a lot of people with soil tests in the county. I know we're really pushing that, especially with our algae problems and things we've had. We don't want the nutrients going down the tile, down the rivers, and algae bloom. We're trying to work on shutting that down. That's why we're trying to, especially with the ISDA, we're trying to push, hey, keep track of what we're doing. Try to do the right thing, be careful with our manure, where we're putting it, utilize setbacks and those things. That's pretty important, okay? So along with this, soil test can really, really help pay at the end, like he said. It used to be, I'm not gonna lie, grew up with Dad. I mean, we opened the fertilizer gate so far and just went, and that's how it was. And now technology has just been incredible how we can get to where we're at now and doing the right thing as far as that goes. So I thought I'd add a little bit of humor. I put a couple things in here. Like I say, this slide was, you just don't guess and just try to do the right thing as far as that goes, instead of just make something happen. But you can see here's a couple slides I always like a little bit to give you a little bit of break in the action here a little bit before we get into the PARP topic. But you can see these are always, these guys all here basically thought, hey, we'll try to solve a problem and fix it one way or the other, which most farmers we know are pretty creative and can do a lot of different things. You always got definitely the duct tape, right? Duct tape can fix a lot of different things. Vice scripts, those always come in handy, right? I don't know about you, but every time we got one, we always use it as a hammer and use it for everything that it shouldn't be used for, and so they never even work, okay? But I suppose they can work for that, right? Here's another slide, I guess, just to give you something a little different to look at a little bit tonight here as we wrap up. All right. And another duct tape thing, if your stuff's falling out and your shells all break, try duct tape in a refrigerator, I suppose, correct? Always pretty good there, okay. So for our PARP topic, this one, again, I tried to get, especially what Olivia talked about a little bit and where we're kind of going, even in segue into next week a little bit. It's pretty good to keep record and to soil sample, like I say, keep records of what we're doing from year to year. That's ultimately pretty important. And I know this may seem pretty basic. I'm just going to try to hit some high points. From time to time, there's no doubt the state chemist office comes out and there's no records and people don't know where they're at. If they did keep them, they don't know where they got to and misplaced them and things. And so I guess we've all probably been there at times, but it's pretty important to write things down nowadays. You just don't know where things are going and how things are going. So it's pretty important, especially for restricted use pesticides. Okay. And I think it's best to focus a little bit on reasons why we need to focus on why keep pesticide records. Okay. And then the how becomes a little bit easier, I feel like. So I'll spend a couple slides here just going over some reasons why we do it. And then you may think, yeah, those are pretty good points. Doing it's not a problem. It's just making our mindset to do it and take time and write things down. I mean, just like being in school again, it's like, do I need to take notes, or do you think I can remember all this stuff? Yeah, back in school. And nowadays, I don't know about you, but I'm getting older and I don't remember things like I used to. Okay. But definitely one of the reasons it does aid in management decisions. Okay. There's no question when you got different things going on, no matter what the crop, your records, it's a good management tool to have records. Okay. You can keep them. It's kind of tells you how a pesticide performed from year to year. Were there any pesticide problems and pest problems? How did that season's weather conditions affect the performance of what you sprayed and when and what the weather was? Were there any drift problems? What adjuvants were used? Okay. These are all things that kind of can help select different pesticide products even the next year. Okay. Pesticide records can also assist when you're planning crop rotations, since some pesticides have restrictions on what crop they can be planted the following year. Aids in pest resistant management. Okay, so they're just a lot of obvious decisions when things can be made when you're keeping record from year to year on a management standpoint. Okay, it just gives you a good heads up to try to scout things and look for things the next year. You can go on and on about this as far as how important it is. Okay. Basically, don't want to have a lot of used product either. Okay. I know last week I talked about the Clean Sweep program where you can once a year. I know that happened here this week. I think on Tuesday at Noble County, there's a Clean Sweep program, and you can get rid of your leftover chemicals. Especially as we know, one of the big news this year was the dicamba and not being shutting that down, the EPA has. So I'm sure there's maybe some leftover product there. So that's always a thing. So with record keeping, yeah, you hopefully don't have that big of an issue with having a lot of chemicals left over. I mean, you save money, just like Jamie was saying, with saving on fertilizer and things like that. You decrease the amount of leftover pesticide that needs to be stored. Okay. All right. Another reason, provides liability protection. Okay. Good records will generally show that you made pesticide applications under the recommended conditions. If you receive a drift complaint, records will likely help you out. There's no question. I mean, they're probably going to do more good than harm. All the complaints from the state chemist office are investigated. Pesticide records supply evidence that the pesticides were mixed and applied in compliance to the label. Don't think like it just can't be proven that you didn't do the right thing there, because they can, but records will back things up. Okay, as far as that goes. So it's pretty important. Another reason is to use to justify insurance and manufacture claims. Okay. Pesticide drift claims can be expensive. I mean, you're talking, I suppose, thousands of dollars on a nursery or an organic farm, maybe a couple hundred damage on a garden. You're talking probably more in the 10,000s if you're talking a whole field of corn or soybeans, big crops or something like that. But the big thing is human health nowadays. I mean, if human health gets affected, I mean, you're looking at, I mean, hundreds of thousands of dollars probably. The sky's the limit there. So insurance agents will have to ask for your documentation to protect you and protect the legal defense if there's a lawsuit or something you can't settle out of court. You can use your pesticide records to claim that the pesticide manufacturer has a poor product or performance of damage. I mean, you did the right thing according to your records, but it was maybe something wrong with the pesticide itself that caused issues. Okay. And so, like I say, you can see here where you may get some drift on a garden or a soybean plant or something like that, a soybean field. And as we know with dicamba, that's been the hot topic the last couple of years. Here is another reason requested in real estate transfers. So especially if farmer's net worth comes in from the land, more so when the crops are grown on it, of course. But if land is sold for industrial or residential development, an environmental audit would have to be probably conducted, okay? So pesticide records are very helpful when you transfer a property. If you're even another landowner takes it over or something, and it's good that they know what pesticides were used the previous year to see if there's any residual and carryover and that type of stuff. So again, another, maybe don't think about it much of all these different reasons, but it is yet another reason for record keeping, especially about pesticides. Hopefully we don't ever have to go here, but again, in medical personnel, for some reason, if some chemicals get somewhere where they shouldn't or on someone, whether it be anhydrous, would probably even be more of a typical thing than a pesticide, hopefully, but records will definitely help that medical treatment to say, hey, what was done here, what was used, how much, and those type of things, so medical assistance can be used. And then again, just part of a pest management plan, okay? Especially if you work with the NRCS for cost share dollars and those things, and even ISDA, Lindsay in her office, Jennifer and things. I mean, they're always going to be looking at, hey, what's going on with maybe some of your watersheds and your conservation priority areas that you want to development. And so they actually do require most of the time a pest management plan to even receive some of these cost share incentives for conservation improvements, such like this here in a picture is for filter strips. Okay. And again, conservation definitely depends on records. There's no question about it. And those pretty important. Restricted use pesticides, okay? Most of you probably know if you got your license or not. Definitely, if you're dealing with restricted pesticides, it's just one of those things you need to keep records. If you have no restricted use pesticide records, you are in a violation. And that is actually separate from a drift complaint. Typically, the state chemist office, again, like I said last week, they're not going out looking for trouble. But if they get called out, that's when they can step foot on your farm, look for a drift complaint, and that's one issue in itself. But when you get there and you don't have records and can't figure some stuff out, that's a whole nother violation. And I know it's probably not a lot, but it can be at least $100 and then some for no records, okay? Yeah, and then just to reiterate that fact that when you're dealing with restricted use pesticides, especially I'm talking to the private applicators, I mean, even commercial guys, I mean, you have your permit allows you to purchase these and apply restricted use pesticides. No one else can. They're not you can't just buy them at a Walmart store because they're restricted use. You have to have a license to do this. And so you are held accountable. If you mess things up on your end, it's on you. Okay, so you consider this a privilege to be able to have your license and have those. So try to do your duty and keep records. Okay, most of us have hopefully read labels. Some of us probably don't dive into those like we should, but it should stay on there, even in big bold letters, restricted use pesticide, and that typically means, hey, I got to keep records on this. Okay, so when you see that, that's a good sign. Try to keep records on what you're doing as far as that goes with this chemical. Okay. And last couple slides just really deal with here. I guess those are some of the reasons why we do it, and kind of starting to get into the how. We're dealing more with here. Records need to be kept for 2 years. You always get that question. I mean, it doesn't hurt to keep them for 3 or 4, 5 or whatever, you know, but definitely for 2 years, you need to keep records. Okay, that's a requirement. And then I know maybe I think it's best to write stuff down when you're spraying the day of, so you get it done and know it. Keep a notebook in your tractor or something. But you know, if you can't, you do have 30 days of the application to actually produce records or get your records wrote down. Okay, and if you've heard this before, probably there is actually no specific forms. I know Olivia had a lot of forms and different things she was showing. The state chemist office site, I think, has a couple drafts, but everyone's different. Every farm's different. They've never come out and said this is exactly what you have to do. It can be on anything, anywhere, form, pencil, pen, I assume paper. I mean, but nowadays a lot of people put stuff in their phones right away and things. However you can generate records and keep records, that's great. Okay. There are 11 required items for a restricted use pesticide record. Okay. For kicks, you got, those are some common ones here. Some of you may say, well, why is this? And I mean, location is definitely just wherever your field is, or however you can describe it, so you kind of know. I don't know that they need the latitude and longitude and things like that there, but like I say, the more detail, the better. But these are some definite things they want to kind of put down on paper of a record as far as that goes, or where you're at with things, okay, in terms of keeping records, okay. And then I also, if you're the licensed person and you have some people applying chemicals under your license, under the supervision rules, some of you probably know that. I know that's a whole nother topic, but the person with the permit is liable. So that question always comes back. I mean, even though someone else did it, you need to try to keep track of that and make sure things are happening because you have the license, okay? And then, yeah, just I don't want to reiterate too much here, but this slide deals more with your fertilizer application records. I know we're talking about pesticide, but I want to include, Olivia kind of talked about the manure side of things, and so I want to include the Cat 14. Most people probably here have their Category 14 license too, and we've been preaching that too, keep them for 2 years. It's just not the pesticide people, it's Category 14 people that need to kind of keep them too. So pretty important, okay. And again, there's just different forms showing you however you want to draw them up in Excel or whatever, and so you can just jot that information down. That's pretty important, okay. Nutrient value, and especially what Olivia talked about, the manure side of things. And then finishing up here, this just to help you a little bit, so you don't get too, I know some people are always like, yeah, you don't want to get out too much and too much things, but really only 2 people have access to your records, or can have access to your records, okay? No one else is supposed to look at those or be able to, besides the state chemist office and the licensed healthcare professional, especially if they got to treat different people or something's went wrong or something like that. That's where they go in effect. But those are pretty important, okay, that for those people and those people only. Here's just again a little bit just to reiterate a little thing, sum everything up here, pull things together here, but remember the manure must come from a CFO to qualify for the record keeping requirements by the seller. If you are kind of selling manure and different things, it's always important. And that's always a question too, like if you're actually, if you're a landowner, you're supposed to keep track of your chemical records, but I know some of you or other people have landlords that spray things, or maybe you have a chemical dealer, and that's perfectly fine. They may keep the records, but as long as you as a landowner know that there's some records being kept by even like I say, a farmer or a chemical dealer or something like that, that's important. But that is one requirement as a landowner. Actually, you are supposed to try to keep records of your property and what's going on. But generally, those people don't, because they're not the ones spraying. But you always should make sure that someone actually is, and keeping track of those. Always something to keep in mind a little bit, I guess. Yeah, and then just like I say, another slide here of just some different other items you can always put down. Like I say, the more the merrier, from especially the weather and scouting from year to year. Again, it's a lot of these years jive together and you can't remember what's what. So doesn't hurt to require and put down a lot more information as far as that goes. That definitely helps. Okay. And so that's about it. I tried to go through that pretty quick, just to hit some high points on your record keeping skills. Again, here's my email. If you have any other further questions, don't want to ask them online tonight or something like that, or need some more clarification or any help, feel free to shoot me an email and we'll kind of go from there. So Lindsay, back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Brad. So if you guys have questions for Brad, you guys can either unmute yourselves or just type them in the chat box. To wrap things up for this evening, we will have another poll question, series of poll questions go out to you. And there they are on your screen. While that's happening, while you guys answer them, let me see here. Let's go ahead and start. I'll share my screen with you guys. As of right now, we have different things happening in Adams County. On Tuesday, the Soil and Water Conservation District will be having an open house plot tours happening over at 500 South and 550 West, between 500 South and 400 South in Bern. And then they'll have like some again on August 31st up near in Union Township. And then they also have their soil and manure testing programs. Brian with NRCS, they are starting to do some financial assistance programs for 2021. If you have questions about that, you can go ahead and call the office, or you guys can go to your local offices for those of you who are out of county. And then lastly, with the state, we also have ISDA. We do have free soil sampling and manure sampling happening in the area, in certain parts of the St. Mary's watershed. I'm not sure we have too many from Allen County, but we do have Upper Maumee and then some in the Allglaze as well. Free soil sampling and manure sampling for those of you who do need to get a manure sample for any other reasons. You guys, my number is on there for you guys to go ahead and call me. And that's all I have. Thank you so much to Brad, Jamie, and Olivia for jumping on tonight, giving their presentations. We will be back for our last workshop next Thursday. Jamie will be talking about what do we do with these soil test results we get? What do they mean? And then Brad will also be having a park topic. Jennifer, Katie, Brad, Jamie, am I forgetting anything?
No, I think you got everything covered, Lindsay. You guys should be able to see the results from the poll. Again, if you have any questions, you can contact us with the contact information that was provided.
All right, you guys have a great evening. Thank you so much for joining us.